Fantastic. I'm Craig Carlson, and I get the pleasure of introducing not the preacher, Reverend Jimmy Hawkins, because that's been done. We were in that great sermon, and also not the incredible justice advocate at the national level and over at for so many years at Covenant, and then also right from the very beginning of the Moral Monday movement. I think that's something that wasn't shared this morning, but you were there for now it's been over a decade, working with the Moral Monday movement, and then also the Poor People's Campaign. So for all of that social activism, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you shared with us, a great friend of the RAC for so many years, and we just are thrilled that you're back. I'm actually get the pleasure of introducing Jimmy Hawkins, the accomplished author and historian.
It's misunderstood. I talk about that in the introduction of the book. There's always some pushback, and black people always heard things like, well, you're not happy here, go back to Africa. LeBron James was told to shut up and dribble. You're talking too much about social justice issues. And so I wanted to present black protest as patriotic. Really wanting the country to be the country that it says it is, especially in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, a place for liberty and justice for all people are treated fairly, when throughout its history it has not been. Not just for African Americans, we know for Hispanics, for Asian Americans, for LGBTQ community. People have always been suppressed in the history of this country, okay? And so then another one was to have a conversation about black history, because the conversation about black history is too limited. It really is always about slavery and about Jim Crow. And black people are treated as perpetual victims. And I really have a lot of pushback with that black people have not been passive. They have protested throughout American history. And so I wanted to talk about that, and especially the ways in which black people have not only protested, but been present in almost every region of this country and have made viable contributions to the history of this country. Okay? So, the uniqueness of this book, there are two things that I really am pretty pleased with this book that's unique. Most of the talks in history about black history and about black protests start with 1619. Everything starts with 1619, but actually the black presence in this country predates it by at least back to Columbus, 1692. Where blacks were explorers, they were sailors, they were servants, they were a part of the journey here. So when the Spanish came, blacks were here. Blacks came with them. As a matter of fact, it's really fascinating. What's the oldest city in the United States? St. Augustine. St. Augustine, depending on what part of the country you're from. On their webpage, they read that the oldest city in the United States was founded by Europeans and African Americans. Fort Mose was a part of, matter of fact, the Spanish offered freedom and said that any blacks who make their way to Spain, if they swear allegiance to the Spanish crown and become Catholic, they're going to be free. And they built a Fort Mose there. That was a barrier between the Spanish and the British to actually protect the Spanish. And so the black presence in this country, and I love these books, but the black presence predates 1619. So these are some of the books that talk about black protests. Lerone Bennett Jr. with Confrontation Black and White, and the Black Protest by Joanne Grant. They start with 1619, and a couple go to the end of the Civil War, and a couple go to the end of the Civil Rights Movement. But none go from the 1400s up until 2020. So it's the only book that does that, okay? And then another uniqueness is that, and go ahead and hit it touch it 5 times. What I do is divide the book into 5 sections based on black identity. And so this is based on what blacks were saying about themselves. This is how blacks self-identified. The first group were African identity. These were the first blacks to come here were Africans, and they wanted to maintain an African identity. Nation was colored, Negro, black, Afro-American, and African-American. Okay. So from 1450 until 1775, talk about pre-colonial life in America. And of course, John Hope Franklin of Chapel Hill fame wrote the book From Slavery to Freedom. And I played with his title and called this section From Freedom to Slavery. Because by the time 1619 gets around, the first blacks who came and encountered the British at Jamestown were indentured servants. So they had either a term of 7 to 14 years for indentured servitude. Then they became free. And actually, there was no racial separation. It was class separation. You had those who were servants, and you had those who were the owners. And it didn't matter whether you were a black or white servant, you were treated the same. And as a matter of fact, many blacks became free from indentured servitude. They owned property. The first Anthony Johnson was a property landowner. He owned slaves. As a matter of fact, he was engaged in the first lawsuit to enslave another black man. It's really an interesting part of the history that we have. But in white supremacy was not the code of the land. We think that white supremacy has always been a part of American history, but it's not. It started with slavery and had to justify slavery, so they came up with this whole doctrine of white supremacy, that blacks are inferior, that God has ordained them to be servants, because Christians had to answer the question, how can you be a Christian and own another human being? And so we see this whole, it's a fascinating period in American history where it's dealing with the issue of race by not dealing with the issue of race. But the first, from 1619 to around the 1660s, race and slavery were not one. It did not make you a slave to be a person of African descent, okay? And so we see again, they came with the Europeans. They were been a part of the Spanish and Portuguese from the 1440s and 1450s. Came here, this one here is sailors, pirates, explorers, and helped to explore all of these areas, okay? And so then Lerone Bennett Jr. said that he talks about how blacks begin their journey with the British experience, again, because again, we have to separate it. Before 1619, blacks had encounters with Europeans, but it was not the British. The British became prominent. So all of our history is actually the history of American-British relationships, but again, we have a lot of history before in Chicago and all of these other areas, New Orleans, where the French were, and things along that line. We don't count that though because they weren't of British descent. But it's a part of American history that I'm really fascinated by how we have this economy. But he talks about how for 40 years or more, from 1619 till about 1660, he writes that Negro Americans accumulated property, participated in the public life of the community, and mingled and mated with whites on a basis of substantial equality. So again, that's an important thing to remember, that during this time frame, when the colonies were being developed, that there was not an issue of race and black inferiority. And so then, one of the things I do in 2 sections of the book, I kind of divide it down in half. I talk about the conditions that were being endured, because you cannot understand the protest if you do not understand the conditions that they were protesting against. So this is the African time period again. This is from 1776 to 1877. This is the colored protest. So I talk about slavery. You know, Florida has said, their State Board of Education, and the governor has said that, you know, if you were a black in a blacksmith, then it was actually beneficial to you because you could use that, you know, once you got free and you were a blacksmith. Oh, he is so crazy. It's quite insane, to be honest with you. And I don't understand what in the world is going on in Florida. Florida really has seemingly, it used to be Texas, but now it's Florida. They're coming out with these inane statements that really don't think the CRT conversation really is nonsensical. You know, it's history, it's American history. We're not talking about history that's from the damn children. It's not the children they're worried about. They're worried about the parents not being able to hear the truth. I really think there's a lot of it. But slavery was horrible. It was horrible. And Harriet Tubman said slavery is hell. And just to state it plainly. This whole concept of stolen, blacks were very much aware that they had been stolen from Africa. And so this whole, and I deal with it on 2 bases wherein the slave owners would accuse the enslaved of stealing from them. You know, you can't leave it out. They say, well, you stole me. So whatever I work on, I have a right to the produce of. And so they would take what they needed in order to survive because they got bare essentials. Seasoned with Pain talks about how brutal it was. Whipping was the enforcement policy of slavery. it was brutal. They did, it wasn't wherein black people were submissive, but the threats were real. And you could be brutalized, you could be killed. If you were enslaved, you could be murdered with no consequence at all. Slave name, free name, the enslavers would give them a name, but they also had their own names that they would keep. They went from sun up to sundown. Then they had to do their house chores, and then they had a chance to do their own chores. Oftentimes, your owner was your father. In many situations, we know Thomas Jefferson enslaved his own children. Now, they had a different caste system where eventually a couple of them just walked away. He never pursued them. But oftentimes on many plantations, the owner would be the father of the children and would sell the children as well. We see here the fancy trade is a way of talking about prostitution within slavery, where certain black women, especially very fair-skinned black women, were concubines or mistresses and were prostitutes. They were put into that trade. And then we have the breeding machine. And what really makes American slavery so heinous is that after 1808 and after slavery, the African importation was outlawed, they came up with a system to breed slaves. So we're going to keep continuing to reduce slavery by breeding human beings for profit. As a matter of fact, once 1808 passed and the South had this whole slew of slaves, they began to deport them to the lower part of the South. And so it was a breeding machine. Thomas Jefferson bragged to George Washington. He said, a third of my produce comes from breeding slaves. And then the whipping post again, talked about brutality of slavery. The auction block was really, that's the piece that slaves dreaded, because families were separated. Yeah. And the vast majority of enslaved human beings never were put back with their families. And so you see, after slavery is over, in black newspapers and newspapers across the country, that enslaved family members were put in ads, do you know what this person is? They were sold down south. I've never seen them again. And black churches became means of communication. And then black death. Once a person who was enslaved, in most situations, they were simply put in the ground. There was no funeral, no acknowledgement of their passing. As a matter of fact, many owners would not take time out for a funeral. They just had to be, it's business as usual. And so one of the parts on the colored identity, and again, the African identity is for those first generation Africans who said we have an African identity. By this time, by 1776, these are second, third, and fourth generations of enslaved. So they are Americans. They want to stay here. They want to eradicate slavery, and they appropriate the title of color. They say, who are we? We are colored Americans, and it's really a famous statement by one Reconstruction member of Congress. He says, we're not red Americans, we're not white Americans, we are colored Americans. So this was the title that was appropriated as a form of pride. You know, we are different from other people. So it brought them together. We see Frederick Douglass was oftentimes, he would go back and forth. He would be a Negro, he would be a color, depending on when he wrote. But this is, most of the time, during this time frame, you see the colored identity. And I wanted to talk about resistance to slavery. We know about the insurrections. There were over 250 land insurrections and over 500 slave rebellions. They never talked about the mutinies on slave ships because they had to suppress that because they wanted investors to feel that it was a healthy investment. But many of them did never reach shore. We know about Amistad, the famous movie with Morgan Freeman, but it was a strong part of it. And so this book is a really good book. It talks about, it's the only book I've seen by Eric Robert Taylor that talks about the mutinies on the ships. And one of the most fascinating stories, he talks about this one slave ship that reached shore with no one on board. There was no evidence of violence, or they don't know what happened, but every human being on that ship had disappeared. So you were taking your life in your own hands because the crews were outnumbered, and oftentimes the women had free reign of the ship, and oftentimes so that the crew could have access to them. And that was the reason why. But they would oftentimes participate in rebellions, and they would help the men to get free. So there were rebellions, and they had to take out insurance on slave ships because there was no guarantee that they would reach shore. So this whole part about resistance, African-American historians will say that from the moment they were captured, there was resistance. The whole time, they were captured in the heart of Africa, they were taken to the coastline, there was resistance the whole way. And then once they put on the ship, even when they were on the ship, because historians have always said, well, they were passive on the ship, they were confined, but there were massive mutinies all the time on these ships. Okay? And then, go the other way. Oh, no, go the other way. Yeah. All right. And so during this time period, what do you notice about these years, 1776 to 1877? It's a centennial. Yeah. Well, what about that first year? What happened in that first year? Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution happens right around that time. And what happens in 1877? Reconstruction. So we're going from the most significant wars this country has ever dealt with. The American Revolution and the Civil War. I call the American Revolution the War of Independence, the Civil War the war to end slavery. And that's from the black perspective. Blacks welcomed both wars. They wanted the country to erupt because they saw it as a means to eradicate slavery. And they participated in both wars to such a degree that both presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, said pretty much the same thing. If it had not been for the presence and the fighting of the black troops, the cause would have been lost. Both of them were reticent. Neither wanted to recruit blacks. George Washington was a slave owner. He didn't think it was a good idea to arm the slaves. He said, I don't think that's going to be the way we're going to go. So he resisted. Then the British started recruiting black troops, and he had to because thousands joined the British. And the British said that any who fight for the British side will receive their freedom. And the British were much more true to their vow of freedom because the Americans stepped back after the war was over. They promised freedom for a lot of the enslaved, but a lot of them were kept enslaved even after fighting in the war. And so between this time frame, the country really is dealing with the issue of slavery in a way that it has not since the Civil Rights Movement. It's called the unfinished revolution because after the American Revolution was over, the fight for independence for the nation had an impact on the consciousness of white people in this country. How can we fight for the country's independence and hold slaves? Throughout this whole period, in the 1770s and 1780s, you start to see all of these northern colonies in northern states abolish slavery. Over that conversation, is we cannot be a free land and hold people. And every one of them abolished slavery, except in the South. The South is a region because that's what's the heartland of slavery. There was too much money being made. They never supported any type of abolition. And so it's called the unfinished revolution. And I'm really fascinated by George Washington because he struggled with the issue of slavery. He was born a slaveholder. His parents had slaves. When he died, we see that he freed all of his slaves after Martha was to die. He said, well, Martha might need somebody to take care of her. But other than that, I'm against slavery. But he had a lot of pressure on him throughout. The American Revolution was an unsegregated fight. You go to Valley Forge, the Rangers will tell you there was no segregation between blacks and whites. Actually, we went from an unsegregated army to a segregated army. George Washington had pressure from Lafayette, who told him, how can you be a slaveholder? And Lafayette came back on a famous tour about 10 years after the war, and he still pressured Washington, and he told George Washington, he said, if I had known that I was fighting to establish a slave nation, I never would have fought on the side of them. And so he has a lot of pressure, and so we see again in his statements, but then, when Hercules, his chef, left, he put out a reward for him. When his wife's maid left, he put out a reward for him. So he never could muster the moral courage. Now, Thomas Jefferson, we know about Thomas Jefferson, okay? All Thomas Jefferson cared about was his own luxury. If it went through slavery, it did not matter, and so he would have enslaved anyone. But we also see the abolitionist movement happens in this country, the Underground Railroad, and people of faith played a tremendous role in both. The abolitionist movement, especially as it grows in this country, it started slow, but by the time the 1850s, it's really gaining steam, and abolitionists are making major roles. We know about William Lloyd Garrison and a lot of the white abolitionists, but there were so many black abolitionists. And have you seen the movie Harriet? That is a powerful movie, and it does a real honest estimation of the Underground Railroad. There were white Quakers who were very engaged in the Underground Railroad. In fact, they were the only white denomination that opposed slavery almost from the beginning. So they had a strong presence. But most of the conductors, the ones who took the escapees from one place to another, were blacks. And especially on waterways, there were black watermen that came from parts of Africa where they worked on the water. And so they would help not only take bodies, but they would also take communications from one plantation to the next. Okay? And so then we have the war to end slavery and Reconstruction. And this time frame has been called the period when America practiced democracy. It is amazing what was done in those 10 years. And our pictures of white members of black members of Congress, all of these southern states, because they had to, because the federal troops were in the South to enforce Lincoln's vision, even though Lincoln had been assassinated, but blacks had access to education, to state constitutions. North Carolina's state constitution was impacted by Hood and other black abolitionists who were elected and were clergy in the state. And they declared public education for every child in the state of North Carolina. So we see all this revolutionary period happens, but then we know what happened in 1877 with the election in 1876 with the compromise wherein the South said that they had a deadlock between the two candidates. And Fillmore, the Republican candidate, became president because the Republicans promised to remove the federal troops from the South. And so that was the end of Reconstruction. Okay? So from the next time period is the Negro identity from 1878 to 1954, and it is probably the most brutal period in American history in race relations. The domestic terrorism is unimaginable. And this is a difficult part to read about how black life lost its value, completely lost its value. And the irony is that during slavery, black life had value because there was a financial worth attributed to each slave. Worth $500, worth $1,000. But after slavery and the federal troops are gone from the South, they took out all of their wrath on black people for losing the war. Because remember, the South was devastated. I mean, PBS has a special on Sherman's march to the South. He says, I'm going to make it howl. And he burned down Atlanta, and everywhere he went, he says the only way to end this war is to produce such great suffering that the South quits. Because we know that there was a lot of support throughout the South in these large southern cities. But we have white supremacy really takes on. Domestic terrorism is unimaginable during this time. We have between, let's just start with the 1920s. No, it was in 1908. Up until the 1930s, a series of racial massacres that happened in this country. 1919 has been called Red Summer. James Weldon Johnson was the editor of the Crisis at that time. He said, so many black people were killed. That one summer, 25 American cities went up in flames. Race massacres. Chicago, and not just southern cities, where black people were killed. By Elaine, Arkansas, it's estimated that 300 black people were killed over 2 days. So we have these humongous, and for small infractions, like again in Chicago, a young black boy was divided the imaginary line in the lake, and he drifted over into the white line, and they stoned him and killed him. And then a riot broke out, and the city almost burned down, and they have pictures of people burning black parts of town. We know about we know about Washington, D.C., we have St. Louis had a massacre. So again, 25 massacres. In 1908 is another high period. Springfield, Illinois, there were about 20 massacres in 1908 alone. But 1908, Springfield, Illinois, caught the nation's attention because obviously that's the home of Abraham Lincoln. And so that's when the NAACP came out of that massacre that happened. But it's really, again, when you read that part of the book, go ahead and gird yourself because it's a difficult part to read. And then this system in the South where blacks went from being slaves to sharecroppers to convicts. The South, we know about sharecropping. North Carolina had sharecropping galore, wherein blacks they didn't own the land, but they would work the land. And if there was a store, they would be indebted by the end of the year. So oftentimes they owed more than they had made. It's a way of keeping blacks on the land because blacks, they wanted to labor and wanted free labor. And then they came up with the convict system, wherein blacks were being picked up for vagrancy. If you did not have a job, you could be sent to prison. But basically to provide free labor for states, especially Georgia. Started it, excelled in it. Georgia had a saying that bad boys made good roads because they used them for infrastructure improvements and leased them out to corporations. And for the first time in American history, more blacks were in prison than whites, even though whites were in America in the majority. And then we see, I call it the old Jim Crow, but this is the instillment of Jim Crow throughout the country where it becomes codified, and not just in the South, but also in the North. There were Jim Crow regulations in the North as well. Oftentimes Northerners, I know we got a few Northerners in here, but Northerners would look at the South and say, well, you know, we never treated people of color like that. You weren't much better. Because, you know, slums and the segregation in the North and the low-paying jobs, things along that line. But also during this time frame, the black protesters really, where blacks began to leave the South. Okay, go to the next one. And so we have these, and so also at this time frame, George White was kicked out of Congress in 1901. He was the last remaining representative in Congress, and he was kicked out. Congress says, well, no black people can be in Congress anymore. So they literally made him leave. But he talked about black success and how blacks have reduced literacy by 45%. And this again between 1865 and 1901 when he issued this statement. Since there are 2,000 lawyers and doctors, $12 million worth of school property, $40 million worth of church property, 140,000 farms, homes valued at $750 million, personal property valued at $170 million. And he also talks about black farms. He talks about 20,000 churches, 7 colleges, 17 academies, high schools, 600,000 acres of land in the South alone. And he says, and I think this was the most important statement, all of this was done under the most adverse circumstances. Because you have to remember, blacks were not just fighting against poverty, but there were social policy and laws to keep black people basically in their place. That was the whole purpose of it. All right? And then here we see the migrations. We talk about the great migrations of World War I and World War II, but there have been several migrations where black people left the South. They said, look, we're not staying here. We're not putting up with this. And of course, the famous one is around 1915 to 1930. It's called the First Great Migration. Well, some of these there's a slave trail of tears, where blacks were forcibly moved from the northern part of the South to the deep South. There's immigration conversation versus colonization. Immigration is where blacks say we're going to leave. Colonization is where whites say we're going to kick you out. Contraband migration, between 500,000 and 700,000. This is the Civil War. When blacks heard that Union troops were stationed nearby, they went there because they knew they could be free. Also, there's a migration from rural areas to southern cities that happened as well. And then there's the exodus from the south to the west. Then the first great migration that we really must live through from 15 to, well, not this one. I think I may have overstated. That many of us lived through the second great migration. And reverse migration, which is happening now. Well, blacks are now leaving the north and the west, coming back to the south. And the greatest example of that is Atlanta. I mean, so many black people have moved to Atlanta, but and it's really interesting because and it's happening all of the time. It's really fascinating to hear people talk about, well, they're leaving the north now because their parents brought them there or they were born there, and they're coming back. Okay, I'm going to speed up. I got about 3 minutes left to finish these slides. This is a part where I wanted to talk about black history because, again, I made mention that most people know about slavery and about Jim Crow, but the black contributions to this country have really been downplayed. The fact that blacks were inventors, doctors, lawyers, and especially in the West. There's no mention of black people in the West or Hispanics and Mexicans. They made viable contributions to the development of the West. The lasso was a Mexican cowboy invention. And so we even see that what we call cowboys, a white worker was called a cowhand. Negroes were called cowboys, and that's the title that has maintained. But blacks had a viable position, and the relationship between Native Americans and African Americans has been undertold as well. Now, this guy Katz on the left, the Black West, has written several good books on the black purpose of the West. And I really like that book because it's a pictorial, so it's filled with pictures of blacks in the West. But this guy here, we know about Bill Pickett. He invented many lasso techniques in war dogging, rodeos. They have a rodeo named after him. He was on the stamp. This is the Lone Ranger. This is Bass Reeves. He's the original Lone Ranger. And his biographer talks about how the Lone Ranger that we see on television, Kemosabe, that was actually based on Bass Reeves. He was a deputy marshal in the Ohio territory before it became a state. And he wore disguises. He arrested over 1,000 fugitives. He was married to a Native American woman. He also had a partner. The partner sometimes who was Native American. So all of this was adopted and turned into, what's the guy's name? Who played the Lone Ranger? Anybody know? Okay, I don't either. But there's a movie coming out I think it's on Apple TV in November about his life. There's Daniel how do you say his last name? Daniel, the guy who played Martin Luther King in Selma. So he's playing Bass Reeves. But all of this was whitewashed. All the black presence in the West has disappeared. And so again, this is a part of American history that we need to recount. Again, as many as 25% of those living west of the Mississippi were of African American descent. Some say as many as a third, and then 1 in every 4 cowboys had African ancestry. Okay? So this is again 1878 to 1954 Negro identity, and these are just black towns. There were at least, there were a couple of hundred black towns over the course of years that were settled all around the country. And then this one, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington visited Durham. Now we know we have several black Wall Streets. Tulsa, Greenwood says that they're a black Wall Street, but Durham also, you'll see the marker out there calls itself Black Wall Street. And W.B. Du Bois came and visited Durham, and he was so impressed with what he saw in Durham that he wrote. And I really like this last section here. He says, in Durham, a black man may get up in the morning made from a mattress made by black men, in a house which a black man built out of lumber on which black men cut and planned. He may put on a suit which he brought at a colored haberdashery and socks knit at a colored mill. He may cook victuals from a colored grocery on a stove which black men fashioned. He may earn his living for colored men, be sick in a colored hospital, be buried in a colored church, and the Negro Insurance Society, North Carolina Mutual, will keep his widow and children in a colored school. This is surely progress. So there was these enclaves around the country of black towns where black people built their own communities. And then, again, the destruction of black towns and communities. We know about sundown towns, that in many areas they will have signs up saying that if you are black, you're a Negro, when the sun sets, you need to be out of town. And that was, and they started that between 1890 and 1968, where these towns took great pride. And the guy who wrote that book, he did, the way he figured out which ones were sundown towns, he looked at their census rolls. And they would have a black population this year, one year, and the next year would disappear. So they ran, there were actually massacres where they ran black people out of town. Not that black people left, but they were ran out of town. Then I mentioned Red Summers, 1908, 1919, okay? And then this is again Negro identity, and this is when blacks start calling themselves the Negroes. The Harlem Renaissance is really just an outpouring of black creativity. Around 1929, for the next 10 years, Harlem was the headquarters for black sculpture, black literature. It's really, and it's a condensed outpouring. It's really fascinating. Langston Hughes was alive during this time frame, and to see the black talent. And what made the Harlem Renaissance unique was that for the first time, black art was based upon black awareness. It's not trying to be like the classics, like the Greeks and the Romans, or based upon white culture, or this pride in black culture. The Negro soldier, black troops, soldiers have fought every war in this country except the Spanish-American War. Every war in this country. And each time, to the military's shame, blacks had to prove that they would fight when the war would break out. They had to fight just to be enlisted. World War I, only around 300-some thousand blacks were allowed because they were not allowed to enlist. World War II was a little different, but the blacks had fought for this country and died and bled for this country because they saw it as a means of making America America. So if we fight for this country, then surely they will treat us better. And then I call the New Deal the same old deal because there were contributions for blacks, but not on the level that they should have been. And many blacks were limited in participating in the New Deal because of Southern Dixiecrats. They told Roosevelt that if you open this thing up to everyone, we're not going to vote for it. And his compromise was that they turned it over to regional agents. So the regional Southern agents could decide who got the benefits, and blacks were left out of many of the benefits. Okay. And then we're coming to the end. This is black identity from 1955 until 1987. And so this is basically the civil rights period and the aftermath of civil rights. You know, 1954 with the decision, the Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. We say that's the start of the movement, and it goes for the next 10 years. But we say all of this outpouring of the results of black protests. And so the civil rights movement, and one thing I liked, I did, not everyone liked it, but I wanted to highlight that the tactics of the civil rights movement were not new. All of that stuff, the sit-ins, the protests, the marches, had always been done in the history of this country. 1920, there was a silent march in New York City where 20,000 African Americans marched through the city, mostly women dressed in white. So I really want to point out that the civil rights movement was the most successful because of the television cameras. Right. You could see it. And let's speak a little racially just a moment. White people have never believed black people when they've told them about what was going on. It can't be that bad. It can't be that bad. But when they started seeing it, America was shocked. Selma shocked the country. And they really began to, that's why the civil rights movement gained a lot of momentum. And Johnson told King, you got to make me do the things that I do. He wanted to do it, but he needed, in saying that, you got to get the country aware of what's going on in the nation. Therefore, that makes it easier to get legislation passed. And then women have always played a role in black protests from the beginning. And especially during the civil rights movement, we always talk about King and Malcolm X and others, but the women were really not just behind the scenes, but they were leaders in the civil rights movement and every movement in this country. And youth leadership as well is the same story, okay? I'm going real fast. Martyrs of the civil rights movement, everyone lost their life. Whites lost their lives. Children lost their lives. Preachers lost their lives. Policemen, 2 black policemen were killed. So there were martyrs around the country. We know about the 3 who were killed in Mississippi, but there were so many martyrs in the movement. And the Black Power movement started when Stokely Carmichael raised his fist and says, what do we want? Black power. And y'all know Tim Tyson? Tim, in his book about the rebellion in Oxford, North Carolina, Blood Don't Sign My Name, Tim said that when he did that, he scared the devil out of everybody, black people, white people, you know, because Black Power was a revolutionary statement, because they thought it was threatening and violence and things along that line. And then we have the inner city rebellions, especially after King was killed. The whole country went up in flames in '68. And then black freedom fighters. I love the picture of King and Malcolm X because they were fighting for the same thing, but they never combined their efforts together. And Cone wrote a book, Malcolm and Martin, and he said that eventually they would have come together. Because King was saying, right before Malcolm X got killed, he says, my dream has turned into a nightmare. And King became very critical. We reread the dream, but King has some King said, America is in need of a psychiatrist. The country was sick. And so he really became quite radical. We read the nice King, but the radical King had, and especially it's this talk about war, his opposition to the Vietnam War, to nuclear weapons. He was very much a prophet today. And so we had these black freedom fighters who were black veterans who literally protected the marchers. They said, look, we're not turning the other cheek, okay? All right, so I'm not taking we're not going to start anything, but we're not going to take anything either. But all of this was part of the black protest in this period, okay? And then we have the wars in African Americans. I stated the 2 sections where I talk about what black people were dealing with. Redlining, refusal to give loans. Urban renewal. James Baldwin said that urban renewal is Negro renewal. The war on black farmers. Black farms were decimated because they could not get loans from the UDA. Refused to give black farmers loans. Environmental racism, which term was coined in Warrenton, North Carolina, with Chavis. The war on drugs, the war on crime, were intentional wars against marginalized communities. Nixon intentionally said we're going to have a war on crime, war on drugs, to shut down the hippies who were voting for Democrats, and to shut down black people, to suppress the vote. That was their strategy, to incarcerate people. We know about economic racism, disparity between black and white wealth, gentrification, and then even robots today are responding. AI, so I'm afraid of AI because AI is coming out with some racist determinations. And they're saying that one is based on the programming information they receive, but also that when they read the web pages of America, they're filled with racist thoughts. And so they're influenced by what they see. And so we have to keep an eye on AI, okay? And then very quickly, African American is from 1988 to 2020. And so Jesse Jackson met in New York City in 1988 and said, no longer do we want to be called African, colored, Negro, or black. We're African American. And it took off. It took off. So up until this day, we call ourselves African Americans, and then we see the political renaissance from the 70s, 80s, and up until today where we elected a black president, Barack Obama. It's called the Second Reconstruction, and the African American vote really comes to the forefront of being influential. Biden is president because of what happened in South Carolina, because Jim Clyburn endorsed him, and the black vote in South Carolina brought him to the forefront of the Democratic primary. And from then, he never lost steam after that. And so, now, I will say this about African American identity. Black has never gone out of vogue. When black people talk to each other, we're black. There's a black man running for office over there. But when we write papers, we're African Americans. So that's our proper term. But young black writers now are saying that we want to be referred to as black because it's more inclusive. African American, you have to be born here in this country. So it cuts out if you're from the Caribbean, or from Haiti, or from Africa, and you move here, you're out of the mainstream. Even a little group is saying, well, you weren't born here, you should not get reparations, but I disagree with that. because the black experience has been the black experience in America, regardless of where you're born. Okay, and then lastly, and from the 88, from the 70s and 80s, you see this a second Renaissance, and this has been called the Second Harlem Renaissance, or African American literature. And for the first time, the difference is that they're now receiving awards for their work. In the Harlem Renaissance, they were read, but they had to have investors, and there's really not a lot of support, no recognition from wide society. But film started with black exploitations. Y'all remember Shaft and all that? Yeah. I don't care what they say. I love those movies. You know, and for the first time, blacks were not depicted in degrading caricatures. They were not clowns. They were not maids. And so that's why black people loved the black exploitation period, because they were the heroes of the story. And then we know about African American music, and African American music has had a disproportionate impact on American culture. You look at hip hop today. I mean, hip hop has taken over basically music as a genre. Now, I don't agree with everything that happens in hip hop. I'm not one of those, I apologize, because I think there's a lot of misogyny in hip hop, a lot of violence in hip hop, but as a genre, it has had undue influence. But it's really just building upon the momentum that blues and jazz have had. So African American music has really influenced American music to a degree that almost no other cultural attribute has. But the African American athlete, in 47, when Jackie Robinson was allowed to play, and then all of the other sports began to integrate. And we see now that some of the most vocal individuals in this country about social justice are athletes. LeBron James is known for making all these statements. And I talk about Colin Kaepernick, but actually the WNBA, the female pro basketball players, started before Kaepernick. They were protesting police brutality before then. Then African American philanthropy, and I put that in because African American philanthropy is basically based upon giving up to build someone else up. We're going to help you to escape discrimination, and that's the foundation for it. Okay, so then, I think that should be, and so then talk about woke life and social media protests, the Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQIA protests in this country, and especially from the black perspective, and especially as it relates to the black church. The black church has not been woke when it comes to LGBTQ rights. It has not. And even now, there are clergy who will not join the Poor People's Campaign because of its support for the LGBTQ community. And so that's an area of protest. Then I call Obama the dream and Trump the nightmare. I won't go any further because I represent an office that is nonpartisan, okay? We don't take sides. So I did step out. And then close with 2020. And that's basically the outline of the book. Okay. A little more than 30 minutes to do that, but are there any questions anyone can answer?
I don't have a question, but I've been sitting here biting my tongue to avoid saying what I'm going to say now, which is I saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, and when it was first came out, I guess, I stumbled across it, maybe in my computer, I don't remember, but the impact that movie had on me was stunning. 12 Years a Slave. And it takes you through the whole, from this point over all through all this world and life down over to there. Huge. And those are the kind of movies that I think we should have more of.
Yeah, 12 Years a Slave. It's harrowing. It's really, and the powerful part of that movie is that this guy was a free man who was kidnapped, sold into slavery in the South, and just saw and it was very realistic. And then he's out of favor right now. Will Smith's movie on Apple TV.
I don't see that.
Emancipation. It's just like that. It's just like 12 Years a Slave. Okay. I know we're not fans of Will Smith right now, but it's a powerful reenactment of the brutality of slavery. It is so powerful. And again, people don't realize it. If DeSantis would watch these movies to get a better idea. I still remember. I think it was Piedmont. It was Cape Fear Community College. This was back in the 70s. There was a professor there teaching that slavery was not a bad experience for black people. I still remember an article over that. And so again, it's all about becoming more aware. The only way we can deal with our history is to face our history. And to be fair and impartial. You know, to talk about the bad, horrible things that happen, but also the good things that happen. You know, we can't portray white people, all white people, as white supremacists, as supporters of slavery, because this country, the Civil War, was a real fight primarily between white people. in this country. Most of the soldiers, now a higher percentage of black troops died disproportionately, but it's a fight between whites over the issues of liberty and justice and slavery. And I'm convinced that we are where we are now because Americans don't know their own history.
That's right.
We don't know how far we have come. We don't know where we were. And again, I'm 64. I went to a segregated school the first 5 years of my life. And so those of us who are in here, we experience it directly. Yes, sir.
You certainly can say something about this woman, Nicole, who's now teaching at Howard, who got run out of North Carolina. That's an example. How does that fit in? Doesn't that fit into the remaining racism and corporate?
Yeah, I talked about Nicole Hannah-Jones from her UNC experience where she, I don't know if I'm this right setting to talk about that because I want to come back. But you know, we had the same thing with her. And who else was at UNC who left? Eric Dyson also had the same type of experience. You know, there's this, what's his name? Running for president right now, African American.
Scott.
No, Lord, no.
Cornel West.
Cornel West is running for president right now. He left Harvard to go to Yale, then he went back. So this whole issue of the black scholar, when you get too controversial, you make statements that are you can be out of the mainstream, but just don't be too much out of the mainstream. Don't be too insistent. But again, this country has such a wide and varied history. And again, I will say this, I wrote in the introduction, I hope that every racial group writes their story. The Mexican American story needs to be told. They have such a strong, the Native American story needs to be told from a Native American perspective. Because all we talk about the destruction of their culture, but we don't talk enough about their contribution. The Constitution of the United States was influenced by the Six Nations of the Iroquois up in the northeastern part of this country. Benjamin Franklin made mention of it. James Madison, when he wrote he wrote a 3-volume expose on constitutional style worship because they weren't in Europe. He talked about them as well. And so the Native American contribution, much of what we have, you know that over 26 states have Native American influenced names. All across this country. And the contributions that we take for granted came out of Native American culture. All of those stories need to be told to be a part of the American framework. Yeah, so it was an interesting experience that she had here. Yes.
I have maintained that the South won the Civil War because of something like Gone with the Wind and Birth of the Nation. Propaganda focused this whole history, this whole myth, and it still works very powerfully. In, you know, more people when they reenact the Civil War want to be Southerners. And that's the losing side.
That's the losing side. And they were traitors.
And what we have statues all over the country.
Yeah.
So it's propaganda, and that's because I guess the wealthy have a means of the propaganda.
Yeah. And the statement was the South won the Civil War. When I say the South won the Civil War, they definitely got beat, but they won the aftermath of the war. And what happened was that northern businessmen wanted to do business with the South. There was so much wealth in the South, so they set aside all civil rights legislation, they set aside all human rights legislation. They went with money, greed over justice. And so that's the problem in this country. We oftentimes go with money and with greed over justice. And it has the lasting impact. And I think that's our tragedy. And I did a piece, I was at Senate School not that long ago, and one of my I talked about what do Presbyterians believe. My next one was what Presbyterians don't believe. And then I talked about what are some of the things that we've got to deal with. And capitalism is an issue that we as Christians have got to contend with. Capitalism goes unchallenged in this nation.
Right.
If you're called a socialist or a communist, it can destroy your career, whatever field you're in. And we have this mindset still from the 1950s that communism is godless. And so we justify as Christians the behavior of capitalism, and we have the greatest wealth disparity in the world. It is not just between blacks and whites and other people, between whites and whites. Most people in this country are impoverished and poor because a few, less than 1%, control all of the wealth in this country, and that's the legacy of capitalism.
That's
And
right.
we even say that people are rich because, and this is what the Jews used to say, because God has blessed you. But Jesus came and said, I don't think that's the way God looks at this. And so we have this challenge, and I think especially the church has got to challenge the sins of capitalism. The church is silent. The church does not take that nonsense
right.
on, and we've got to. I know a couple of hands that were up, but I know we got to go home. Well, I want to honor, of course, but I don't want to keep people here to go there.
I'm a retired fourth grade teacher, and as you know, the Parents' Bill of Rights was just passed by the North Carolina legislature. And I know that some of the lessons that I taught my fourth graders, I would be fired for now, just 5 years ago. Give us hope, give us courage.
The Parents' Bill of Rights, where parents can have undue influence on what happens in the schools.
And the curriculum.
And sadly, it mirrors Florida.
It mirrors Florida.
The legislation mirrors the
In
legislation
Virginia
in
as
Florida.
well, they're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Virginia is crazy.
Yeah.
And it's a sadness. It's fear that what I have is going to be taken away from me, that my children are going to be influenced by wokeness. And I think what we've got to do is, I'm going to skip over the discussion because you know what's going on. Book bans and all of this craziness, CRT. We've got to maintain our firmness in doing what is right, in talking about it. The children are not afraid. The children are not the problem against the parents. The parents are afraid. So we've got to convince them you have nothing to be afraid of. No one's going to take what you have. And we've got to understand that also there is a sense that the country's been invaded by people of color. You know, we have all of these people of color coming across the border, and they're going to take away. And part of what the rich have used is to make middle-class people and poor people feel that they're under threat, that what they have is going to be taken away. And we've got to assure people that they're not. I'll say this just in, you said give hope. The church is always to have a remnant of folk who are talking about justice. Unrelenting.
Right.
Don't stop, because it goes in a cycle. It goes in a cycle. Right now we're at a very low cycle culturally in this country, but there will be a time when it will at least come halfway back up. So keep fighting, and it only happens because people are struggling, people are demanding and protesting. Because again, look at the gains we have made. There was a time when black people couldn't vote at all within my lifetime. You know what I'm talking about. And so we've seen change. Now there's voter suppression going on right now, trying to take us back. But there was a time also when a living wage was not guaranteed. If we had talked about reparations 20 years ago, it was a non-starter. Now everyone's participating in reparations. That's because people have been struggling over it. People have been demanding and insisting and saying, this is the path we need to take. So it will bear fruit. But I tell you, this is a rough one right here. Okay. And there was someone, yeah.
I just have a question. So, why are so many blacks Christian? So if they're slaves of white people who are Christian, and they're treated so poorly, why did blacks go to Christianity?
In the book, it's fascinating because the first Africans who came here rejected Christianity. If you know, this is not, because all they heard was Exodus, Genesis 9 and 10, be slaves, the curse of Ham, and then Galatians were be obedient to your master. But then they started finding out for themselves. They heard about the book of Exodus, where the slaves were liberated. They read about the prophets that justice rolled down like water. So they became more and more informed about Christianity. Like the Great Enlightening had a great impact. And so as they became more and more informed about Christianity, they saw Jesus as a liberator. You know, one of the things I love saying is that James Cone in the 1970s wrote, Black Liberation. And we called him the father of Black liberation. He was not the father of Black liberation. What James Cone did was echo what he had heard growing up. This was nothing new in the black community what James Cone was talking about. They always seen God as a liberator, God as a deliverer. But Cone, publicized it, and so it went before the world and really had a profound impact upon seminaries and divinity schools. But that's always been a part. You talk about social justice in the black church. You don't have to worry about any kickback. Now, when I go to white congregations, I have to be careful. Because you start talking about social justice in certain cultures and certain churches, that's a non-starter. They don't want to hear about social justice. I had one guy tell me, said something, well, the word justice and being a Christian, I know, and somebody said, some people, I know what he was talking about, might reject it. I said, how can you reject justice in being a Christian? You can't read the Bible and not talk about justice. It's throughout the pages of the Bible. Justice, we say two things in the Reformed faith that we know about God. Love our humility. We say God is mysterious. We don't control God. God does not do our bidding. But God is God of love, and God is a God of justice. We are certain about those two attributes of God. And so you can't, and so as they learned more about the faith, and they really made it their own, and they developed their own theological positions, even in opposition to white culture, white theology. Because again, many Presbyterians wrote in defense of slavery from a theological position, supporting slavery. But the blacks were saying, no, you need to read the rest of the book. More than that one statement in the book. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, Jimmy, I wanted to add a footnote to your second Renaissance. Sometimes we get a better perspective of who we are from people who are not in this country. And so I have colleagues I've worked with a long time in Norway, and when we got around to talking about what it means to be an American, they said something that just amazed me. They said, what we think of as American is black culture. It's music, it's literature, it's athletics. And I had never thought that would be that's how we were seen. That's who we are.
And that's a very positive statement. Usually they say some other things about America. And especially, to be candid, after the Trump administration. Oh my Lord, I thought Bush took us to a new level. But Trump pretty much eradicated America's position in the world. And Biden's trying to build it back up now. But we are not held in a favorable position at all. People don't look to Americans anymore for leadership. And we've got to get out of our minds those glory days of World War II and World War I. Those days are long gone. Right now, we are leaders of tyranny. You know, we sell more weapons around the world. We see all of these fights that are going on around the world. The question has to be asked, where do those weapons come from? They're not manufacturing those weapons in the Sudan. America is the largest arms dealer in the world, bar none. Russia and Germany and France also sell a lot of weapons, but we're number one. And so what we are exporting to the world right now, the only thing we really have to offer is our culture. That's really it. Because we think because we have a lot of money that we can buy favor with people. People say no. And so again, we have fallen out of this favor. Yes.
An observation that Presbyterian Church, and all its configurations, has centered in my mind been kind of a microcosm, a reflection of what's been going on racially in this country. That it has been a proponent of slavery in some ways, and then there was this component of the Presbyterian Church that said, maybe not. That's kind of what was going on in white America across the world. And this church, Church of Reconciliation, with all its woes and whatnots, is still part of the Presbyterian Church USA. And so we, as a congregation, as a church, has inherited that legacy with all the negative stuff. And I don't know if you have any comments about that, having yourself grown up in this environment.
Yeah, have y'all seen William Hughes' book on, what's the title? Presbyterians and Slavery. It's recent. He's out of Columbia. It came out last year. UYOO. I would really encourage you to invite him. He will do a webinar for you. It's powerful. He talks about the history of Presbyterian and basically racism. Presbyterian Church is a mixed bag. We're right there. Y'all know. We like to walk right down the middle of that line. We don't want to go too far to the right, too far to the left. And so during slavery, we never, as a denomination, never really took a strong stand against slavery. We said, is slavery a moral evil? Yes, it is. Are slaveholders guilty of a moral evil? Well, let's talk about that at the next meeting, next Presbyterian meeting. And so, and during the Civil Rights Movement, it's really when we started to step out, Lord, I'm to the age where I remember. Who is the state clerk of the Presbyterian Church during the he was on the cover of Time.
Eugene
Carson Blake was determined to be on the side of the Civil Rights Movement. He was one of the few white clergy who spoke at the Civil Rights Movement. He's been arrested. He was arrested in Camp Echo up in Maryland. He says, we want a non-segregated church for a non-segregated world. He was, and the Presbyterians went ballistic. They wrote him letters. They said, one guy wrote him a letter, said, I heard you was in jail. I hope they keep you in jail. You know, it was an embarrassment to the church. And so the church, but the General Assembly upheld everything that he did. Now, since that time, and I would dare say right now, the Presbyterian Church is at the forefront of justice issues. We really are. We really
We
are.
better stay there, too.
Yeah, we are doing some quite radical things. You know, that statement that we released at the last General Assembly equating what's happening in Israel with apartheid. I think the disciples of Christ have said something similar, but everyone else is leaving Israel alone. They won't touch it. We are looked at the leaders when it comes to policy about Israel, Palestine. Our presbyteries are focusing in on racial justice. You read the web pages, you're going to see something about justice on every web page of a presbytery. The tragedy is that we're down to 1.3 million members. Our churches are aging, like all Christian denominations. We're not unique at all. So we're probably at our weakest right now as far as membership. The positive part, we got some money now. I've heard several times we're the second wealthiest denomination. We have 1.3 million members. When you look at all the property, Montree, all of these conference centers, camps that we have. So when you add up all of that worth, we are very wealthy. And that's a positive dilemma because we have these huge churches with 50 people. The opportunities that they can become resources to the community. And we can let people come in and develop nonprofits in these churches for free. So we can become a hub for social justice. And so we're at a point, and when you look at the leadership of the Presbyterian Church, it's the most diverse in the history of this denomination. The stated clerk was African American, our first stated clerk. We have our first woman stated clerk who replaced him. PMA has an African American head, and our offices have an African American. When you look at the top 6 positions in the Presbyterian Church, 5 of them are filled by people of color. And then when you look at the whole staff, it's the most diverse staff that you're going to see with any denomination. Not just African Americans, we have Hispanics and Asian Americans. Almost every racial group is represented. So again, we're at a point where we are catching up to what God is doing in the world as it relates to justice. But we've got to figure out ways that we can be effective. And I close with this because I really appreciate it. I preached for 25 consecutive years, and now I don't get to preach at all. So every chance I get, I take advantage of the opportunities that are before me. But I just want to leave you with a positive word. We are called to be a remnant. We are. And not just Presbyterians, but Christians are going to be a remnant in this country. We are not going to be the largest numbers in this country because Christianity is suffering in America. And some of those who say they're Christians, I don't agree with their positions on Christianity. And I don't agree with the lack of talk about justice. I don't understand how you can be a Christian and not talk about justice. And then when you do talk about justice, the only issues you're concerned about are sexual identity and abortion. And that's it. Don't say anything about poverty. When in their own community there are poor people living on the streets outside of the doors of their churches. And so I'm concerned about the division in the Christian family. I was on the plane yesterday, and a pastor, a bishop I knew from when I pastored in Virginia, he was from that same town, and he and I started talking about, he's evangelical. You know, he's a good fellow. He's holding this Pentecostal, and we were talking about combining our efforts. We've got to. It is a sin for Christians not to work together.
Yeah.
We could be the most sizable force in this country if
That's
all
right.
the Christians work together. And again, under the name of justice. Close with this. Presbyterians talk about justice. Evangelicals talk about proclamation of the gospel. We've got to do both. We've got to proclaim the good news of the gospel. People need hope to know that God loves them,
Yeah.
but people need help as well in their circumstances today. Pastor.
So much. Hawkins, I'm not sure where you want